Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway station, which was how he came to have such an unusual name for a bear. They were waiting for their daughter Judy when Mr. Brown caught sight of him sitting on an old suitcase behind a pile of mail bags. As they drew near, he stood up and politely raised his hat. "Good afternoon," he said. "Can I help you?" "Well, no," said Mr. Brown. "We were wondering if we could help you." "You're a very small bear," said Mrs. Brown. "Where are you from?" "Darkest Peru," said the bear. "I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway. I came all the way in a lifeboat, and I ate marmalade. Bears like marmalade. I used to live with my Aunt Lucy, but she had to go into a home for retired bears, so I emigrated." "Oh." "Aunt Lucy always said she wanted me to emigrate when I was old enough, but now that I have, I'm not quite sure what to do next." As he bent down, the Browns caught sight of a label round his neck. It said, "Please look after this bear, thank you." It was the kind of label you couldn't possibly ignore, and in no time at all, things began to happen. Mrs. Brown thought of a name for him. Paddington. And while she went off to look for Judy, Mr. Brown was put in charge of ordering some refreshments. Paddington. Paddington. "Come along, Paddington," said Mr. Brown. "I expect you're hungry after your long journey." "I am," said Paddington. "Very." Paddington had never been taken out to tea before, and he was very excited. "I don't suppose there are many bears who've been inside a buffet, Mr. Brown," he exclaimed. No, said Mr. Brown. Especially one with buns. I think perhaps I'd better sit down. Yes, said Mr. Brown, trying hard to pretend that he had tea with a bear every day of his life. "Hello, Mrs. Brown," called Paddington as he caught sight of the others. "Don't go away. We're in here." "Watch out," shouted Mr. Brown. But he was too late. Paddington was already up to his knees in trouble. "Henry," cried Mrs. Brown, "what are you doing?" "What am I doing? Look at him. He's all covered in jam and cream. I've never seen such a mess. I don't know what the manageress will say." "Or the taxi driver," said Judy. "Taxi driver?" "Judy's right," said Mrs. Brown. "We can't leave him here, not in his present state." "Don't worry, Mrs. Brown," called Paddington. "I'll clear up the mess. Bears are good at clearing up messes." "Number 32 Windsor Gardens, please, as quickly as you can." "Not too quickly," called Mrs. Brown. "We've 2 more to come." "Is that one of them?" asked the driver. "He's covered in white stuff." "It's only cream," said Judy. "I dare say," said the driver. "But bears is 6 pence extra. Sticky bears is 9 pence. 9 pence extra," exclaimed Paddington hotly. He directed a hard stare at the driver. He seemed to go a funny shade of pink. "Gosh," said Judy, "how did you learn to do that?" "My Aunt Lucy taught me," said Paddington. "She said it might come in useful one day." "Mary," said Mr. Brown, "are you sure we're doing the right thing?" "That," said Mrs. Brown, "remains to be seen. I've never had a bear about the house before, but I have a feeling things may never be quite the same again." When Paddington arrived at number 32 Windsor Gardens, the first person he met was the Browns' housekeeper, Mrs. Bird. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'm from darkest Peru, and I've come to stay." "Peru!" exclaimed Mrs. Bird. Good gracious, whatever next? Don't worry, called Judy. He's going to have a bath. Hold on, Paddington, I'm just coming. Did you say you're from Peru? Called Mrs. Bird. Darkest Peru, said Paddington. In that case, I'd best be getting some more marmalade in. Fancy knowing I like marmalade, exclaimed Paddington. Mrs. Bird knows everything about everything, said Judy. She sounds just like Aunt Lucy, said Paddington. The next person Paddington met was Judy's brother, Jonathan. And while Jonathan put some bubble mixture into the bath, Paddington listened carefully to his instructions. There's some soap, said Judy, and a towel, and a brush so that you can scrub your back. Paddington felt he would sooner just sit in a puddle, but he didn't like to say so. It sounds very complicated, he announced. Well, said Judy, don't forget to wash your ears. They look very black. Black, said Paddington hotly. Black? They're meant to be black. At least, I think they are. For a moment or two, he toyed with the idea of whitening his ears with a toothpaste, but he soon gave that up. There were other, much more interesting things to do. What was that? Exclaimed Mr. Brown. Perhaps it was Mrs. Bird, said Judy. Bang went our tea by the sound of it. Unaware of the alarm he was causing, Paddington busied himself making a foam map of South America. Some of the mountains were very high indeed, and he was about to mark in darkest Peru when he suddenly remembered the bath. What is going on? Exclaimed Mr. Brown. Don't tell me Mrs. Bird's fallen in the washing-up water now. That's funny, said Jonathan. Talking of water. Gosh, cried Judy. Look. Paddington, he's in trouble. To say that Paddington was in trouble was to put it mildly. He tried calling out, help, fairly quietly, so as not to disturb anyone, and then much louder. Help! Help! Paddington, said Judy, you've still got your duffel coat on. I didn't want to get too wet, gasped Paddington. Only I think I have done after all. Help! Why ever didn't you pull the plug out? Exclaimed Jonathan. Pull the plug out? Repeated Paddington. Nobody said anything about that. I shall never, ever have a bath again, he said firmly. It's much too complicated. But before he went to bed that night, Paddington did have one more go. It's what's known as a dry bath, he announced. It's safer than using water, and it's much less messy. The first morning in his new home, Paddington woke to the news that Mrs. Brown and Judy were taking him for a trip on the Underground. There was also a large tray of breakfast things beside his bed. So much seemed to be happening at once, he had a job deciding what to do first. So he started on the bacon. Hurry up, called Judy. We're going shopping and it's nearly time to leave. Coming, cried Paddington. I've never been on an underground before, he announced. I'm not sure if you'll be going now, said Judy. Not with bacon sticking out of your suitcase like that. Look at it. It's for emergencies, said Paddington. Bears often have emergencies. In fact, I think I've got one coming on now. It's very strange, said Mrs. Brown. I've never heard so many dogs. Perhaps it's the fine weather bringing them out. I don't think it's the weather, Mrs. Brown, gasped Paddington. I think it's my bacon. What's left of it? After the excitement of Windsor Gardens, Paddington found the underground much more to his liking, and he hurried on ahead of the others. Everything seemed to have been thought of. There was a moving staircase, pictures on the wall. There was even a sign with his name on, showing which way to go. Paddington, cried Judy, you're going the wrong way. But it was too late. By the time he'd realized his mistake, Paddington was at the top of the stairs again. Here, said the ticket collector. What's all this? You haven't been anywhere yet? I think I must have made a mistake at the bottom, said Paddington. Bert, called the collector, there's a young bear here smelling of bacon. Says he's made a mistake at the bottom. I'm sorry, said Paddington. I'm not used to escalators. We don't have any in darkest Peru. Darkest Peru, repeated the inspector. Oh, well, in that case, you'd better get back down, but don't let me catch you up to any more tricks. You're worse than them dogs. Shoo, go away. There he goes again, cried Judy. Do something, Paddington. That, said Mrs. Brown, was a dangerous thing to say. I think he's done it. You again, said the inspector. I'll have you know escalators is for the convenience of passengers, not for the likes of young bears to play on. It doesn't seem very convenient to me, said Paddington. I've been here ages and I haven't got anywhere yet. We're supposed to be going shopping, said Mrs. Brown. That's as may be, said the inspector sternly. But pressing the escalator stop button without a very good reason is against the rules. Persons are expected to abide by the rules. Did you say persons? Asked Judy. That's right. And I've got my job to do. It's bad enough being pestered by dogs. Well, Paddington's not a person, said Judy. He's a bear. Isn't that lucky? Said the inspector. Well, don't let it happen again. I think you're a very kind inspector, said Judy. Don't you, Paddington? Very, agreed Paddington. In fact, he announced, I shall always travel from here in future. It's a very good station if you don't want to go anywhere, especially if you have an emergency on the way. Paddington had never been shopping in London before, especially at a store like Barkridge's. Equally, Barkridge's had never had a customer quite like Paddington, especially in the gentleman's outfitting department. We would like some bear's pajamas, please, said Mrs. Brown. Bear's pajamas, repeated the assistant. Has Madam tried something in government surplus? Indeed not, said Mrs. Brown. I've never heard anything like it. Have you, Paddington? Never, said Paddington hotly. And he gave the man one of his special hard stares. Yes, sir, said the assistant. At once, sir. He's been sleeping in his duffel coat, explained Mrs. Brown, and we don't want that. We certainly don't, agreed the assistant. Would the young gentleman care for something in stripes? They're all the rage just now. I'd sooner have something in spots, said Paddington. If I had a pair like these, I don't think I would ever get lost, not even if I fell out of bed by mistake. You can say that again, murmured Judy. The changing rooms are on the right, called the assistant. Don't go wrong. I do hope they fit, said Mrs. Brown. He'll be most disappointed if they don't. So shall we all, madam, said the assistant. So far, Pajama Week at Barclage's had been a disaster. In fact, Paddington was the first customer they'd had for days. But if Barclage's were unhappy about their pajamas, Paddington was even more upset by the state of their changing rooms. As far as he could make out, most of the doors were locked. And when he did find one which opened, he practically had to force his way through. On the other hand, once inside, it was all very different. It was more like the inside of a house, and he was most impressed. Paddington wasn't sure how long he slept, but he was suddenly woken by a very strange noise. It sounded just like rain. But as he looked out of the window, he had yet another shock. "Well," said a voice behind him, "what are you doing in our shop window, Bear?" "Your shop window?" repeated Paddington. He suddenly wished he hadn't bought such loud pajamas. "Oh dear," he announced to the world in general, "I think I've been recognized." But to his surprise, the manager of Barclage's was more than delighted with all that had happened. "Bear," he boomed, "you're what we in the trade call a trend-setter. Since you went to bed in our shop window, those pajamas have been selling like hot cakes. Look at them. They've all gone." And to show just how pleased he was, he offered Paddington anything he liked to choose in the store as a present. Paddington licked his lips. All the excitement had made him feel hungry, and he was tempted to ask for one of the hot cakes the manager had mentioned. Then he caught sight of the very thing, some Wellington boots. "I'd like a pair of these, please," he announced. "If it rains the next time I'm in bed, it'll stop the ends of my pajamas getting soggy. That would never do, especially now you've sold out." "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Paddington, "my next trick is impossible. At least, that's what it says in my instructions." "But you haven't done one yet," called Mr. Curry. "You can't have a next trick if you haven't done a first one." "For this trick," said Paddington, ignoring the interruption, "I shall require an egg." "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Bird. "Can't you use something else?" "No," said Paddington firmly. "It definitely says an egg. I'm going to turn it into a bunch of flowers. If I can get my wand to work." "I'd sooner you turned it into an omelette," said Mr. Curry. "I'm hungry." Paddington gave the Brown's neighbor a hard stare. Mr. Curry had invited himself to the party, and the general feeling was that he'd only come for the free tea. The conjuring outfit was a birthday present from all the Brown family, and Paddington was having enough trouble as it was without Mr. Curry's interruptions. "I think it's disgusting," hissed Mrs. Brown, "coming to take the crumbs off a young bear's plate. He'll be lucky if he gets any crumbs off Paddington's plate." Paddington placed the egg carefully on the table and covered it with a handkerchief. "I shall now say the magic words," he announced. "Abracadabra. Hey presto." "Bravo," called Mr. Gruber. "Very good," remarked Mr. Curry grudgingly. "All done by sleight of paw, of course, but very good for a bear." "What What's he doing with my daffodils? Asked Mr. Brown. Shh, Henry, said Mrs. Brown. I think he's about to do another trick. Well, I wish he'd hurry up, snorted Mr. Curry. I shall have another biscuit while I'm waiting. Do you think young Mr. Brown's all right? Asked Mr. Gruber. He's been gone rather a long time. No, cried Paddington. I'm not. It's all dark and I can't read my instructions. I think I'd better try my watch trick instead. Good, said Mr. Curry. I'm fed up with seeing things disappear. Perhaps I could borrow your wristwatch, Mr. Curry. You did say you wanted to see a new trick, said Judy. And you're the only person wearing one. Don't worry, Mr. Curry, said Paddington. It's all in my instructions. Now, I cover it with the handkerchief so, and I hit it with the hammer. Oh dear. Oh dear? What do you mean, oh dear? What's gone wrong, Bear? Paddington consulted his instructions. As he did so, he saw the ominous words, "For this trick, it is necessary to use a dummy watch." I think I forgot to say abracadabra, Mr. Curry, he exclaimed. Abracadabra? I'll give you abracadabra. That was a very valuable watch. 20 jewels. Shockproof. It doesn't look very shockproof to me, said Mr. Brown. And it's certainly not that valuable, said Mr. Gruber. I remember selling it to you 5 years ago, and you didn't pay much for it then. I think I found one of the jewels, Mr. Curry, cried Paddington excitedly. One of the jewels, bellowed Mr. Curry. What about the other 19? I've never been so insulted in my... What's this? I'm sitting on something sticky. Oh, dear, said Paddington. That's my disappearing egg, Mr. Curry. It must have reappeared. Perhaps, said Mr. Gruber, you ought to disappear for a while, Mr. Brown. And while you're gone, I'll get Mr. Curry another watch. I've a whole box full in my shop. Thank you very much, Mr. Gruber, said Paddington. That sounds a very good idea. I don't think I shall reappear again for a long time. One day, Paddington bought himself a camera in the market. It had a tripod and a hood to keep out the light, and there was even a book of instructions. Altogether, it seemed very good value indeed. So after taking a quick bite of a marmalade sandwich, he got ready to take his first picture. There was a very interesting chapter in the instruction book on taking action shots. But it wasn't as easy as it sounded. In the end, he decided to take a family group. It seemed much safer. I hope he's not long, said Mr. Brown. I've got cramp coming on. I wouldn't move if I were you, said Jonathan. We'd never hear the last of it, agreed Judy. He's only got one plate. I've only got one leg, groaned Mr. Brown. Shh, Henry, said Mrs. Brown. I think he's doing something. Paddington consulted his instruction book. I have to measure the distance, he announced. I'll use this piece of string. If I don't measure the distance properly, I shan't know how far away you are, and you may come out all blurred. I'd sooner be blurred than have my ear pulled off, grumbled Mr. Brown. Ooh! I'm afraid Bear's slip knots are a bit hard to untie, said Paddington. Anyway, I think I shall have to ask you all to move. The sun's in a different place. Perhaps if one of us took it, said Mrs. Bird, you could be in the picture yourself. Paddington considered the matter over a marmalade sandwich. I shall press the shutter, he announced, and then run round the front. Even bears can't run that fast, murmured Mr. Brown. Paddington gave Mr. Brown a hard stare through his lens. But as he did so, something very strange happened. What on earth's he up to now? Exclaimed Mr. Brown. He looks as if he's practicing for the ballet or something. Mind my petunias. Too late, groaned Jonathan. Are you all right? Called Mrs. Brown. I think so, Mrs. Brown, said Paddington, except I've pressed the shutter by mistake. I'm afraid I've been having trouble with a bumblebee again. It must have been after my marmalade sandwich. Perhaps I'd better finish it before anything else happens. No one, least of all Paddington, expected his photograph to come out. But to everyone's surprise, when the plate was developed and printed, there was quite a clear picture. Not bad, said Mr. Brown. Not bad at all. What is it? Take a look in my window, said the man. Paddington hurried outside in order to see for himself. Apart from his photograph, there was a label. It said, "Picture of a bumblebee taken by local bear, both very rare." Soon after Paddington went to live at number 32 Windsor Gardens, Mr. Brown decided to decorate the attic so that he could have a room of his own. But like most of his jobs, it got left half done. Until one morning, Paddington decided it was high time he stirred things up a bit. Paddington wasn't sure how long it took him to do the wallpapering, but he did discover one thing. Apart from making him hot, it also showed up the ceiling. The ceiling definitely needed whitewashing. "Is that you, Paddington?" shouted Mr. Brown. "Are you all right?" cried Mrs. Brown. "Yes and no," answered Paddington truthfully. The plain fact was that when he'd started work, there had been a window and a door. Now, there was only a window left. "Perhaps you'd better let yourselves in," he exclaimed, "wherever you are. I think I must have papered myself in by mistake." Paddington expected to be in trouble, but when he was writing his adventure down in his scrapbook that night, he suddenly found himself with several extra lots of bun money. Mrs. Brown gave him some because at long last they had to have a real decorator in. And Mr. Brown's was because he hadn't wanted to do the job anyway. "Bears," said Mrs. Bird, "always fall on their feet." "Perhaps you'd like me to decorate your kitchen for you, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington hopefully. "No, thank you," said Mrs. Bird, and she gave Paddington a little extra something too, just to make sure he didn't. One of the nicest presents Paddington ever received was a torch given to him by Mr. Gruber. He used up several batteries reading under the bedclothes and only came out when he reached the end of a chapter or ran out of air. He also began learning the Morse code in case he ever had an emergency in the night. And it was while he was practicing it one evening that he had a sudden shock. Every time he flashed the torch, he received the same signal back again. He tried the first three letters of his name. P-A-D. Dit, da, da, dit, dit, da, da, dit, dit. It was all very strange. The light seemed to be coming from the direction of Mr. Brown's greenhouse, and it definitely needed investigating. In the morning, when it wasn't quite so dark. The next day, Paddington was up bright and early. Thinking the matter over, it seemed a good chance to kill two birds with one stone and test his disguise outfit at the same time. According to the label on the box, it was exactly the same as was used by Feathers Lock, the famous detective. By the time he'd finished, he felt sure no one could possibly recognize him. "Ah, there you are, Paddington," called Mrs. Brown. "I was wondering where you'd got to." "Paddington, I'm not Paddington, I'm Feathers Lock." "Yes, dear, but I should hurry up. Your bacon's getting cold." Paddington looked most upset as he made his way to Mr. Brown's greenhouse. It was bad enough having his disguise penetrated so early on in the case, but looking around, he decided there was also a definite shortage of clues. Apart from a few earwigs and a large marrow, it was almost bare. He consulted his instructions once again. Feathers Lock was a great believer in taking fingerprints. He even included some special powder in his outfit for that very purpose. Looking at Mr. Brown's marrow, Paddington felt it ought to have some very good prints on it indeed, and he lost no further time in getting down to work. "Talking of marrows," said Mr. Brown at dinner that night, "it's hard to believe, but someone's been inside the greenhouse and taken my special prize one." "That's strange," said Mrs. Brown. "I found an enormous marrow on the lawn this morning. I thought you'd put it out for me." "You don't mean... Well, not... This isn't it, my prize marrow. It was a special out-of-season one I was entering for a show." All eyes turned to Paddington. He seemed to be acting very strangely. "That was my best clue we've been eating," he exclaimed. "It was covered in fingerprints." "I think I've suddenly gone off stuffed marrow," said Jonathan. "Oh, it's all right," said Paddington. "I checked most of them. They're nearly all my own paw marks. I expect I made them when I carried it out of the greenhouse. The Browns watched in silence as Paddington crossed to the window and peered through the glass. "The thing is," said Mr. Brown. "Why?" "Because someone keeps signaling from the greenhouse, Mr. Brown," said Paddington excitedly. "They were doing it last night, and they're doing it again tonight. Look. Dit-da, dit-da." "That's not someone in the greenhouse," said Jonathan. "That's the reflection on the glass from your own torch." "The reflection from my own torch," repeated Paddington, hardly able to believe his ears. "What are you doing now?" asked Judy. "I'm sending another message," said Paddington. "An important one. Dit, 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 da, 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 dit, dit, dit. That means SOS in Morse code. It's for emergencies. It's short for help, I'm in trouble again. One morning, Paddington was having his elevenses with Mr. Gruber when he noticed an old vase. "Broken, I'm afraid," said Mr. Gruber. "And you may not believe this, Mr. Brown, but the person who did it actually called it a jug and offered me fourpence." "Fourpence for a spode," exclaimed Paddington. "He obviously didn't know its true value like you do," said Mr. Gruber. "Still, it is what is known as the slow season." "Perhaps I could stick it back together, Mr. Gruber," said Paddington. "It might speed things up a bit for you." Paddington took things very carefully on the way home, which was how he came to see a notice being put into a barber shop window. It said, "Willing junior wanted, able to sweep floors and look after the shop while the owner is out, apply within." It seemed a very good chance to earn some extra bun money and help Mr. Gruber through his slow season into the bargain. Paddington had never been left in charge of a barber's shop before, and he found it much more interesting than he'd expected. It wasn't until he switched off the clippers that he suddenly heard a voice. "Hey! Don't I get any service around here? I want short back and sides, but nothing off the top. Whatever you do, don't touch the top. And make it snappy. I have a plane to catch." Paddington peered anxiously up and down the street. Mr. Sloop had said he would only be gone a few minutes, but he was nowhere in sight. And he was about to explain this to the customer when he had yet another shock. The man had gone to sleep. Mr. Brown often went to sleep quickly, especially after a large Sunday lunch, but Mr. Sloop's customer must have held the world's record. Paddington took a deep breath and decided to have a go himself. Unfortunately, when he'd finished, the man's head was so bald that not even a strong dose of Mr. Sloop's magic hair restorer made the slightest difference. Paddington was just toying with the idea of spreading marmalade over it when he caught sight of some clippings on the floor. He was a hopeful bear at heart, but he had a nasty feeling that not even the glue he'd been saving for Mr. Gruber's vase was going to help his present situation. Most of Mr. Sloop's customers seemed to have ginger hair. Curly, ginger hair. "Well," said Mr. Gruber, You said you would speed things up for me, Mr. Brown, and you certainly have. That man you glued the ginger hair onto was one of the biggest antique dealers in America. He bought almost my entire stock, but I still don't understand how he got to hear of me. It's a bit complicated, Mr. Gruber, said Paddington. You see, he was wearing a wig, and I must have knocked it off by mistake. It fell in your vase, and when he woke up, he asked me what I was doing with a spode. Truth, Mr. Brown, is sometimes stranger than fiction, particularly where bears are concerned. Have another bun. Thank you very much, Mr. Gruber. There's nothing like a bun, especially after a close shave. One day, Paddington was making his way down the Portobello Road in order to have his morning cocoa with Mr. Gruber when he came across a very unusual poster. But if the poster looked interesting, the view through the fence was even more exciting. And he couldn't wait to tell his friend all about it. It's what's known as a fair, said Mr. Gruber. And if you've never been to one, Mr. Brown, then you have never lived. Paddington always enjoyed his chats with Mr. Gruber, and on the subject of fairs, his friend was obviously an expert. There are slides, Mr. Brown, and roundabouts, and swings, and dodgem cars, and usually there is a big wheel. You must go on the big wheel. It sounds very nice, said Paddington, but is it very expensive? I've only got 10pence. In that case, Mr. Brown, I suggest you visit the fortune teller first. She may know if you are coming into more money. Paddington needed no second bidding. And as luck would have it, almost the first thing he came across was a tent belonging to someone called Madame Zaza. The notice on the outside said, palms red, crystal gazing, patronized by royalty, satisfaction guaranteed. It seemed very good value indeed. Excuse me, Mrs. Zaza, he announced. I'd like to have my paw read, please. I want to see if I'm coming into a fortune or not. I don't usually do bears, said Madame Zaza. But if you cross my palm with silver, I'll see what I can do. Not wishing to spend his 10pence, Paddington rummaged in the secret compartment of his suitcase. I think I've got a Peruvian centavo, he announced. They're silver. I don't take foreign coins, said Madame Zaza. Anyway, crossing the palm means dropping it in and not taking it away again. She broke off and gazed disbelievingly at Paddington's paw. You seem to have a very long lifeline. I don't think I've ever seen quite such a long one before. I don't think it is a lifeline, Mrs. Zaza, said Paddington. It's an old marmalade chunk. It must have got stuck on at breakfast by mistake. Well, I certainly can't read your paw if it's covered with marmalade, said Madame Zaza. You'll have to pay extra and have the crystal ball. Now, when is your birthday? June the 25th and December the 25th, said Paddington. You can't have 2 birthdays a year, exclaimed Madame Zaza. Nobody has 2 birthdays. Except the Queen. Bears do, said Paddington firmly. Bears always have 2. Then that makes it more difficult, said Madame Zaza, and much more expensive. Paddington gave a sigh. As far as he could make out, even if Madame Zaza did discover he was coming into a fortune, he wouldn't be able to afford her fees. But Madame Zaza was already busy with her crystal ball. I see a cloud, she said, a pink cloud. It's getting bigger and bigger. Really, this is most exciting. It's never happened before. You've put candy floss all over my crystal ball. Where are you? Come back. But Paddington had gone. He'd had quite enough fortune-telling for one day, and he felt it was high time he spent his 10pence on something more important. I think, he announced, I can see a journey. all the way to the big wheel, starting now. One day, Mr. Gruber took Paddington on an outing to an auction sale. He bought a catalogue of the items to be sold and then found a seat near the front so that they would have a good view of all that went on. Paddington decided straight away that he liked auction sales. It was all very friendly. In fact, he hardly had time to sit down before someone waved. So he waved back. Then another man waved. £3 on bid. So he waved at him too, and then raised his hat several more times for good measure. £4 on bid. £5 over there. Going, called the auctioneer, pointing at Paddington. Going, gone. But I've only just got here, exclaimed Paddington. Don't worry, said Mr. Gruber. That's the auctioneer. He's just sold something. Paddington gave the man a hard stare. I hope it's not that table, he exclaimed. It must be full of dents by now. Lot 65, one carpentry set, sold to the young bear with the sandwiches for £5. £5? Exclaimed Paddington. For a carpentry set? But I've only got 10p. Mr. Gruber reached for his wallet. I expect it was because you waved, Mr. Brown, he whispered. You see, if you nod your head or even scratch your nose at an auction sale, they often think it's a sign you're interested. Paddington sat very still, hardly daring to breathe, let alone nibble his sandwich, in case he bought something else by mistake. What am I bid for this old highwayman's pistol? Called the auctioneer. Once the property of Dick Turpin. I think I might try for that, whispered Mr. Gruber. I've been after one for ages. Come along, who's going to start the bidding? £10, called someone at the back of the hall. 11, called Mr. Gruber. 12, shouted the other man. Oh dear, said Mr. Gruber. I hope I don't lose it, Mr. Brown. £13. 14, shouted Paddington. Any advance on £14? 15, shouted Paddington wildly. £15, called the auctioneer. Going, gone. Sold to the young bear gentleman on my right. Mr. Gruber began to feel that perhaps taking Paddington to an auction sale wasn't such a good thing after all. Perhaps I'd better not do any more bidding, Mr. Gruber, began Paddington. I don't think bears are very good at it. Lot 67, a very unusual marmalade stand. Paddington hastily changed his mind. I'd like one of those, he exclaimed excitedly. Mrs. Bird's always grumbling because my jars get sticky. What am I bid for this fine piece of antique silver? 5p, cried Paddington excitedly. 5p, repeated the auctioneer. Did I hear someone say 5p? 6p, said Paddington. If you ask me, said a voice, that young bear knows something we don't. Perhaps it's a fake, said another. No one would bid 6p if it were a real silver stand. Going, said the auctioneer desperately. Is that all I'm bid? Will no one make an advance on 6p? Going, gone. And a very good buy indeed, Mr. Brown, said Mr. Gruber later that day. It more than makes up for the money we lost on your carpentry set and the pistol. It more than makes up for missing our 11s too, Mr. Gruber, said Paddington happily. Besides, I think marmalade tastes even better when it comes out of an antique, especially when it's a 6p one.